Hello and welcome to Earnscliffe Strategies Indigenous Insight webinar. My name is Allan Gregg. I'm a principal in the Toronto office. I'm the moderator of this webinar, and I'm joined by a couple colleagues and a special guest, Doug Anderson, who is the co-lead of our opinion research business unit. He's going to walk you through some data that we have. Katie Shaw, principal out of our BC office. She does a lot of work with Indigenous communities, helping them with their advocacy with the provincial government, as well as advancing projects that they might be working on that are government related. And our guest, Dawn Kelly, who is the head of Public Affairs and Communications Canada programs at MasterCard Foundation. Before we begin, a land acknowledgement. We're in 3 different locations, so we won't go through all of the territories that we're occupying today, but we all acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the first people of this land. Those who have tuned in, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function. Feel free to offer questions that you might have, either directed at an individual panelist or to the entire group. We'll be monitoring those over the course of the full hour, and we will get to those towards the end of the conversation. One of the things we want to do today is show you some opinion results from a study that we've been doing. Doug really initiated some 8 years ago, called Indigenous Insights. It's a quarterly study of Indigenous opinion across First Nations, Innu, and Métis Canadians. We're into, as I say, our 8th year. As a consequence, it is the largest, most robust data set of Indigenous opinion in Canada that exists. And we want to show you 3 little examples of the kind of things we probe on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug to start, because he's got his hand on the share screen file, and we will get going. Doug?
On it. Thank you very much. I trust it's showing the right slide now. It should say Indigenous Insights in month and year. Thank you very much, Allan. I'm grateful to be joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and also grateful to get the chance to talk about some of the data that we've got from this study we're really proud of. We've been doing it, as Allan said, for well, we're in the eighth year now. It's a quarterly study where we survey 500 every 90 days, basically, a fresh sample. And so having done 25, 26 waves, whatever we're in right now, we have an abundance of data, and we're just going to share a few highlights to help lead off different sections of the conversation today. First thing we want to talk about is some basic questions that we've been tracking over the whole time about top issues. And we ask it in 2 contexts. One is a standard question that we use in all of our national Gen Pop type studies as well, which is thinking of all the issues facing Canada presently, which one do you think should receive the greatest attention or should be the top priority? And what I wanted to show you is that we find that a sample of Indigenous peoples living in Canada give very similar answers to this question as we would get in a general population survey. So housing, affordable housing, cost of living, and inflation have for the last 3 waves, and we didn't show you data going back further, but it really started to spike up in the summer of 2023. Like we would find with the Gen Pop, are the 2 top issues. But we also ask it in another context. Sorry, here it is. Same question, but thinking about the issues presently facing Indigenous peoples living in Canada, what's your answer in that regard? And what we're showing you here is the tracking on that is similar kinds of issues that sort of float to the top of the priority, but housing here now has a bit more of a gap over jobs and unemployment that's been declining in the last few waves. And clean drinking water conditions on reserve have remained fairly steady over most of the waves that we've done this, and land rights are also among the top answers offered. But there's some interesting gaps in perceptions. And we ran these questions by a national sample of the general population, and thought it would be really helpful for people to understand some of these gaps. When asked about the issues facing Indigenous peoples living in Canada, the national Gen Pop sample is a lot more likely, like nearly twice as likely to say, well, it's got to be clean drinking water and conditions on living conditions on reserve. Whereas, as you can see here from the red bars, Indigenous respondents are far more likely to be talking about housing and affordable housing or healthcare or jobs and unemployment than the Gen Pop is attributing to or is identifying as the top issue. We thought, this was a good example of why it's worth understanding the opinions of Indigenous peoples specifically on Indigenous issues, and also some of the perceptual gaps that any of us can hold, where we assume we know what must be the most concerning issue to people, and maybe it's worth getting a reality check like this sometimes. That's what we were going to share on those issues.
Thanks, Doug. I mean, we call these top of mind concerns, and we let people volunteer whatever comes to their mind when we ask them what's the most important issue. And as Doug suggested, now we're starting to pair up both Indigenous and non-Indigenous opinions. So it begs the obvious question, Doug. I mean, are Indigenous concerns and opinions unique, or is it pretty much the same as we see through your non-Indigenous research?
Well, it's been a really fascinating thing to watch over the 25 weeks, because sometimes things are more aligned than at other times. But also, perhaps as importantly, there are differences of opinion, certainly within Indigenous population as a whole. Right. It's not a homogeneous set of opinions. But what we also find is some of these perspectives are particularly differentiating between First Nations people living on reserve and either First Nations people living off reserve or all other Indigenous peoples that we interview. And sometimes the case is that those have a tendency to align with what you see in Gen Pop surveys. And it makes sense. We're all living sort of similar lives in a major metropolitan city. So some of the things that would be affecting our lives, more specifically on a day-to-day level, might be more aligned than thinking about Indigenous specific issues all the time.
Yeah, we should make that point that we routinely analyze for First Nations on reserve and off reserve differences of opinion. As you noted, they're quite considerable. I mean, Don, you're a subscriber for Indigenous Insights. You've been looking at this stuff now for the last little while. Is there anything in these findings that really stood out for you or surprised you? You went, wow.
Well, first of all, Allan, thanks for having me. It's really good to join you as part of the panel. I am coming to you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, so really happy to be part of the discussion. I think in terms of surprises, and Doug, you touched on it, it's the priority of housing and healthcare cited by Indigenous people, which the non-Indigenous population doesn't seem to think we're viewing as a priority. I mean, really, when you look at the public opinion work done on non-Indigenous people in Canada, we really have a shared priority there.
Right.
And I think there could be a couple things going on. I'm purely speculating, but just based on having sort of been involved in the communications field, I'm wondering if, for example, when people talk about top of mind of Indigenous issues, they immediately go to First Nations on reserve. And what are we hearing about that? And what do I think is going on reserve that is really happening for First Nations people there? They're not necessarily thinking of the large urban Indigenous population, which is First Nations. Half of our people are living off reserve in urban centers and towns. Inuit, Métis people, there's Métis settlements, but a lot of us are living in urban areas and even on reserve. And this might come into some of the misperceptions, I would say, in the Canadian public that, well, don't they get free housing? Don't they all get free housing? Don't they get free healthcare? Not thinking of things like access to healthcare. I may be wrong, but there might be a bit of that going on as well. I mean, we see drinking water really high. And there's been so much attention to drinking water. It's clearly not a coincidence. The government's brought a lot of attention to it. There's tracking now of drinking water that people see in news media. And of course, for First Nations people and others, it is a concern. But I think that's why we see when we think about conditions on reserve, that's the one that seems to pop out as top of mind.
I want to get back into the Indigenous, non-Indigenous differences and similarities. But first, Katie, there is no question that drinking water and land rights, while secondary to concerns about housing, inflation, and jobs, are things that we do see expressed disproportionately by Indigenous peoples in terms of things that are concerned with. How do those concerns manifest themselves with the communities that you work with?
Thanks, Allan. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Coast and Strait Salish people in Victoria. So I think what really resonated with me, and as we're talking about this on that, is really the root around the systemic racism and how that's underpinning a lot of these systems that we're dealing with. So while these are top of mind issues that are coming up, at the root, we're looking at really big needs and the systems changes and the systemic racism that's underlining it all. And I am going to talk a lot about systems and systems change here, but I also want to be fair that we need to be, compassionate and supportive of the people in these systems that are trying to do the change within and on the outside. But it's good to be hard on the systems, and that's really what's upholding these challenges. So from my experience, we do find that there seems to be an unhealthy disconnect between them and us, and a little bit of a zero-sum game when we're talking about these issues. And that's really not the case. There's a real shared understanding, a shared priority, and a shared challenge happening with affordability housing. And it's only reinforced by the systems that are racist that underpin some of these ongoing challenges around drinking water, but also around access to affordable housing, whether or not, you're getting turned away just because that, you're checking an Indigenous box. So these are systemic issues that people are facing every day, but these are shared issues that we all need to lean into and do something about.
I want to get into that a little bit and go back to something that Dawn touched on, because one of the things that really struck me about these findings is how much non-Indigenous Canadians underestimate how mainstream Indigenous concerns are. They believe that Indigenous concerns are all on those issues like drinking water and housing, and they significantly underestimate how concerned Indigenous people are about the same things that they're concerned about: inflation, housing, these sorts of things. I'm wondering, Dawn, whether you think that misunderstanding on the part of non-Indigenous people unto itself stands in the way of reconciliation.
Absolutely. I think it does. It goes a bit to what I said earlier about some of the misperceptions. And even I'm not saying they're all necessarily tied to racism. There's a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, I've always said in Canada, there's probably as much or more ignorance than racism. And I don't mean ignorance in the pejorative sense. I mean, just people don't learn. They don't know. I went to a suburban school in Winnipeg, and at the time, I learned very little about Indigenous issues. I'm told it's getting better, but people just don't understand. And unfortunately, a lot of what they do here is misperception. If you don't really know, the real history of this country, warts and all, you're not going to understand how we got into the situation we're in. If you don't know the past and how that created the present, you're not going to really understand the way forward. So I think there's a bit of that. I think it's getting better, but there's still, I don't want to underestimate how much work needs to be done. And that includes things like the urban reality. I'm in Ottawa. We actually have the largest per capita urban Inuit population in Ottawa. A lot of people in Ottawa, I would venture, wouldn't know that. So I think, and I guess one of the other things holding us back that really concerns me too is when you look at the prairies in some of the Western provinces where we have some of the largest populations of Indigenous people, sometimes you find the attitudes of non-Indigenous people are some of the hardest towards Indigenous issues. And you'd really like to think being together more would create more understanding, but clearly there's a lot more work there that needs to be done. And I think a lot of that connects to education, both education in the classroom, curriculum development, learning more about the history, about our people and about the present, and then just general education and making the effort to make this information more accessible and providing more opportunities.
Doug, I'm interested in your perspective on this, because we've seen this pattern in other research that we've done, is that mainstream Canadians believe that marginalized groups or minority groups view the world through the lens of their marginalization. Whereas this suggests that we actually have a lot more in common than the dialogue suggests.
Yeah, no, it's certainly been the case in plenty of studies that we've done with, you know, this population as well as with others, that we, and humans do it generally, right? Like we all do it all the time, where we feel like we get some information and therefore we are informed. And it's not necessarily the case that the information we have is accurate or sufficient. And yet we conform a sense of confidence of our understanding of what's at play, what's going on, and therefore what the solutions are and what people's situations are like. And yeah, we would see that in a lot of circumstances. And to Don's point, it's usually the case that the more time that communities interface and you know, spend time together, whether working or socially or in community or what have you, the more that we correct ourselves in terms of our understandings of what's really the challenges facing one community or another. This one in particular seems to have some lingering issues as Canadians are more and more of the view that, you know, reconciliation needs to occur and there are wrongs to be corrected and there are opportunities to pursue that are mutually beneficial. And, you know, there's a sort of growing enthusiasm, but it's still, as Katie said, or maybe Don put it better, describing this, you know, some degree of ignorance, if that's, as you said, not to use it in a pejorative sense, but we need to correct some of our understanding in order to make sure we're moving forward in a way that's truly mutually satisfying.
Katie, last word to you on Indigenous concerns and top of mind issues.
I think my reflection is it's such a privilege to get to work with Indigenous communities when I get the opportunity, and I learn so much. But the reality is that our systems are still very much so at the truth moment. And I think a lot of Canadians too, we're still grappling with truth, and we need to figure out a way to step into that in a good way that can go towards reconciliation. I think there are a lot of advancements happening and there are a lot of systemic changes going forward, but part of that truth is understanding that we have a shared live experience together. And so when I look at these issues, affordability and housing, I think that we tend to other when we don't need to. And I think we're still at the truth on the reconciliation. And there's just so much opportunity through reconciliation for us all to thrive and all of us to prosper. And I think economic reconciliation might be, you know, that really important path forward that we need to lean into specifically in Canada.
Good segue into our very next section. Doug,
Oh,
you want to show us some
Sure do.
Indigenous opinions on reconciliation, how we're doing?
Absolutely. So thanks for leading us right to it, Katie. In recent years, how much progress do you think has been made towards economic reconciliation in Canada? And as you can see here, there's very, very few who feel like they have seen a lot of progress. But, you know, by and large, there's 69% who say they're seeing at least something. The way that I would interpret the data is 58% saying little or no is troubling. And so, you know, that's a gap that that almost certainly needs to be addressed. My button's not working, pardon me. When we look at these answers again, comparing respondents who are First Nations living on reserve, First Nations off reserve, Métis, we also include in our sample Inuit, but never enough in order to analyze the results on a standalone basis. Which actually reminds me, I should have mentioned that somebody had tossed the question at me. This study of 500 Indigenous, we work with multiple suppliers, including one that's an Indigenous supplier, to help us go into community and find respondents. And the profile is reflective of the Indigenous population as per the last census information that is available on it. So it really is proportionate by province, by gender, by age. there are different skews on certainly on region and age than there would be if it was a Gen Pop study, but that's the nature of the sample. But what we're seeing here on this slide is, asked how much progress they're seeing, you can see a striking difference between people living, First Nations people living on reserve and all of our other respondents, where those living on reserve are twice as likely, let's say, to say they see a lot of progress, another 46%. So total there of 70% saying they see some or a lot of progress being made on economic reconciliation at the community level. And finally, this was a really interesting question that a topic that we started to pursue more recently, and it's about Indigenous worldviews. And it seems to me that in the general population, there hasn't been a lot of understanding about what Indigenous worldviews means. But when we've examined some core principles or tenets of it, they tend to be things that a lot of people in the general population can embrace and can get behind. It can feel like that's a valuable thing to have as part of our economic growth plans. To have things be long-term and sustainable and viable for multiple generations. And there's a lot to it that fits with a broader perspective. But here within the Indigenous population, clearly a very important thing to include Indigenous worldviews, principles, and values in economic growth.
Doug, the difference in the first two slides, really, really interesting. I mean, because I believe for some time that one of the barriers to reconciliation is fatigue. The Canadians, but non-Indigenous Canadians, see that the problems facing the Indigenous population are just intractable or impossible to solve. And you see that kind of in the first slide, where Indigenous people are saying, well, we're really not making much progress. But in the second slide, you see something that quite different on the ground, and especially for First Nations on reserve, 70% say that at least something, if not a lot, is going on. Does that suggest to you that we're actually making some progress on economic conciliation, especially among First Nations on reserve?
So I'll obviously offer my comment on it, but I'm really curious to also hear Dawn's perspective on this. But one of the things that I expect is occurring is the level of ability to demonstrate change might be different if you're living in Vancouver versus what's going on in a community on a reserve, where there can maybe be something that is more community oriented about economic reconciliation and building opportunity. Whereas perhaps if you're, working in Toronto, working in, a major metropolitan city, you might not see day to day the same evidence of economic reconciliation related to your life as others might. That's a hunch, a working hypothesis, let's say.
Let's bring Dawn and Kitty both in on the same question. I mean, Dawn, your organization clearly is committed to reconciliation. I mean, are you seeing any kind of progress on the ground in terms of economic reconciliation now?
I think part of the answer is exactly what Doug said. If you're in the city, you're dealing with a lot of other issues that may not be impacted by your cousins or family on reserve, where there may be improvements in housing or maybe more control over resource activities in the area. Really directly connected to economic reconciliation is education as well. I don't think it's simply about where are the jobs. Let's funnel Indigenous young people into the jobs where they are. They may not all want to work in the resource industries or other areas that are doing like a lot of recruitment efforts, and some will, and that's fine. I think, we have found at the foundation where our goal is to support 100,000 Indigenous young people through education, then onto meaningful livelihoods. Part of the answer is giving them access to quality education in their communities. And it may not necessarily being able to build a brand new state-of-the-art school, but we have community learning hubs where students can learn actually in their community. They're getting like it's high quality internet access. So they're not getting pre-recorded instruction. They're getting interactive instruction. They have access to all the resources, school books, materials that they would if they were going to, for example, the University of Manitoba, where we're seeing some of these community learning hubs starting. Yet they're still surrounded by their community. They're surrounded by their language. You know, if they have to go to the city, they're dealing with things like just public transport, childcare, can I get a part-time job somewhere, those sorts of things. Whereas when they can stay in their community, they have access to all those supports that they've had. So I think that's a big part of the economic reconciliation we have to remember, is that they're able to get the kind of education they need to really pursue the opportunities that they want to pursue as well.
Katie, do the communities that you work with see economic reconciliation progress being made, and what do they want to happen that isn't happening?
Well, I will say I work mostly in BC with intersections on the federal side, and I do think the nations that I'm working with are seeing movement. I think this government has done some very pointed efforts in their First Nations fiscal framework that they're attempting to negotiate, and I think that the province and the feds are also looking at different areas for, you know, loan back guarantees on major projects. So these are starting points. At the root, though, I think the self-governance and the ability to determine what the economic development opportunities for their community need to be is the fundamental change we need to lean into here. You know, we tend to, as our systems tend to provide direction and decide for all communities what their economic future is going to look like, versus going into communities and allowing them to have their own plans and develop their own vision and develop ways that they can stay close to their community, just like you're talking about, Dawn, so that there isn't that loss of culture and that loss of connectivity. And I think that's essential, really. Like, the most success I'm seeing is where Indigenous communities themselves are able to map out their economic future, map out their economic priorities, and then work with the nonprofit sector, work with government, work with the private sector to advance those. I think a really good example is the Cedar LNG here in BC, which I think surprised a lot of people that the government approved, but it's a great, great project. You know, this is the first majority owned Indigenous LNG project, and the Haisla is leading it. That's fantastic. We need to see more of that. And that doesn't need to be huge LNG projects. That can be other smaller economic vehicles. I think there's a great space around technology and advancement in technology and AI in the tech sector, and we're not providing enough space for them to, and I say them, but Indigenous communities, to drive their own economic futures and define that without having programs pushed on them that they need to fit into boxes around, which I find is very, very demoralizing in many ways.
The last thing we want to talk about is governance, and we're going to get there. But first on, I mean, in our own work, we've seen a real change over the last 2 years as Canadian businesses have really come to the recognition that this is an issue that they could no longer ignore. And we see that time and time again. The interest in subjects such as this is kind of indicative of that. Yet for all that recognition, most of the clients we work with are uncertain about what they actually should be doing to advance reconciliation. They know that maybe a land acknowledgement is nice, but substantively, they really don't know what initiatives they should be putting forward. What advice would you give Canada's business leaders today? What are the things they could be doing that would make the biggest difference?
Well, there's a few things, and part of it depends, of course, what kind of business you're in. I mean, I would say for any larger scale projects, especially resource related, is really pushing the governments and others to come up with genuine approaches, ideally led by Indigenous people, which is how these things should always work. For example, to get an approach that really confirms free, prior, informed consent prior to any project starting. You know, in some ways, Allan, businesses have been ahead of governments for a number of years on this, because they often found themselves getting caught in the middle. They thought they had checked the right boxes, and often which were very inadequate to begin with, but they thought they had checked them. Then they found resistance from Indigenous communities because they weren't brought on board, or they weren't on side and may never be brought on side. But it's important that kind of discussion happened prior to starting, because otherwise, you end up getting caught once you've already embarked on this major development. So that would be a big thing, is the free, prior, informed consent. I think the slide that we saw that showed that Indigenous people want their values, their worldviews, their principles embedded in development is key to any development or any project, whether it's Indigenous led or not. I think that's a really key thing. The other thing I would say is I'm certainly not an expert in economic development. I can show you all my checking account if you'd like. I take my word on that. But really, there are experts. And for example, there was the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, which was put out in 2022, I believe. And it has 107 calls to economic prosperity in it that really are directed at, there's something in there for everyone, whether you're a government, whether you're in business, small, medium, or large, whether it's like a large industry, you can find solid recommendations, a path forward in there, and that will really help guide your work in the right way with Indigenous people. Because you're right, Allan, there is much more recognition that these are things that need to be done. Rights need to be respected. Indigenous people need to have that say, and we need to see free, prior, and informed consent. So that I think is going to work for everyone. And again, if Indigenous values, principles, and worldviews are in there, that's good for everyone too, because that's about sustainability. It's about upholding rights. It's about all those things that really we should be doing from day one.
Katie, Don touches on something really interesting there, because I mean, I think part of the hesitation on the part of the Canadian business community in actually doing something substantive is a lingering belief that Indigenous communities don't really want development. That what they really do is they want to stand in the way of development. What would you say to that business leader who marshaled that case?
Well, I think I want to lean into what Don's saying a lot and just amplify everything that you just said. I really appreciate it. I would say that is not at all the case of the communities that I speak with, but it's also community by community. Like every community across BC, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, have different priorities that they're seeking to build out with their economic. And some of it's major projects and some of it is not. But you need to meet people where they're at and allow them the time to build that free and prior consent and also co-develop and co-manage their assets on the land. Like this is essential for us to move forward. Businesses are always looking for certainty. Businesses are always looking for pathways that provide, structures that they can count on so they know what their regulatory process is going to look like. You're not going to get that unless there's agreement on what's going to be developed on land. And that starts with working with nations, communities, local businesses, and just basically municipal governments as well. This is a collective effort that needs to take place, and Indigenous people need a real seat at the table to do that. I think the province is starting to work really hard, and we're seeing some really great work, but these processes and this inclusion, it's often we're debating. We're stuck in a debate on who should be at the table helping manage the land and helping develop it. And we're not in dialogue. We need a dialogue that's actually progressing somewhere so that we can come into agreement and communities can decide for themselves what they want to build and what they don't.
And just a reminder to the people who have tuned in that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to ask any questions to the group that we'll get to towards the end of the conversation, either as individuals or as the panelists as a whole. There are 94 calls in the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done. But Doug, I'm wondering, because you've explored this in quite a lot of depth, much more than we've just been able to show today, if the foundation of reconciliation isn't economic, that we've got to find a way to close the 10 percentage point labor participation and a 15% wage gap within Indigenous people. Is that what the people who are responding to your survey every quarter are telling you?
Well, I think in terms of defining it as economic reconciliation, that's
Right.
definitely got to occur. Reconciliation has, many different facets to it, but economic reconciliation, you're absolutely right. But that's not necessarily taking care of systemic racism, for example, which is a day-to-day lived experience for many of our respondents. So it's, for many of the population, and not sure that just closing the wage gap necessarily takes care of that, but on economic reconciliation, it's got to be a necessary, if insufficient, criteria, let's say.
Don, what's your view on that? Is the foundation of reconciliation economic, or are there all kinds of other things that come to play too that if we ignore, doesn't matter how well we were doing on the economic front, we'll still have problems?
Well, I think economic reconciliation has to be a part of reconciliation. And if we move forward on reconciliation in the right way, it will happen. And it's already happening. In fact, there were, First Nations reserves that were doing quite well 20 years ago. But I mean, those were the exceptions, and they're in spite of the system, that Katie's been speaking to, not because of it, it's in spite of it. And I think we need to learn from that. But I think if we move forward on the things we need to do in the 94 calls to action, we will see economies improving because of that, because it'll deal with rights. And, we should do the right things for the right reasons. We should be upholding rights that are recognized and that exist. We should be honoring treaties, the agreements that we signed on to as partners a long time ago, the modern self-government agreements, all of those things. We should be doing those right things for the right reasons. But I'll say this, because I know there are people who might roll their eyes when they hear about rights or think we should all be the same, the stuff we've heard for decades. I'll tell you this. If you close the education gap and economic gap, if you close the economic and employment gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the research shows you will add 27 billion with a B, $27 billion a year to GDP.
100,000 new workers right away.
Yeah. And I mean, that benefits everybody. Yeah. That builds a stronger country for everybody. Canada, like every Western country, is getting older. We have more people retiring. The difference is the fastest, youngest growing population in Canada is Indigenous people. So yes, immigration, other things are necessary, but let's tap into this not fully realized potential that we have right here. And again, that's good for everyone. We all win. It's not a win-lose, it's mutual benefits. We all win when we do that.
Katie's just throwing us underhanded pitches here, Doug, because she talked about governance, and that's our next subject area that we want to explore. You want to walk us through some more data?
Sure. Okay, on self-governance, a few more data points that we want to share than we had on some of the other topics. This is a rather generic question on the importance of Indigenous self-governance to you. Clearly, there's a very broad consensus, and it doesn't really matter what community we're interviewing or talking to. It tends to be the vast majority who are saying it's at least somewhat important, and for a third or more, it's very important. And undoubtedly, the reason it's important is because it's going to have an impact. And we asked about a variety of different aspects of life for people living in Indigenous communities. Do you see that Indigenous community negotiated control or authority over each of these areas would end up having a positive or negative effect, basically, on the lives of those who lived in those communities, and asked it on a scalar basis. So we see here the total proportions who are saying either somewhat improve or significantly improve. And with policing, there's 62% saying at least somewhat improved. Interesting that there's a little less confidence with that compared to some others, like resource ownership and management, child welfare, land ownership and management, environmental regulation and protection, for saying that those things would significantly improve with Indigenous community negotiated control or authority over those aspects. But it's very easy to logically conclude that this is the kind of thing that makes it important, because it will have positive impact. But there's also barriers and widespread recognition that funding is a major barrier. 57% saying funding is a major barrier to their community gaining greater self-governance. Another 33% saying it's a minor barrier, which takes you to 90% saying it's a barrier. And lower proportions, but still pretty high proportions here saying engagement from the federal government is a major barrier. There being a diversity of visions over what self-governance looks like. Okay, that's a barrier, but we're getting into, split opinion over whether it's major or minor. Likewise, having the ability and people necessary to take this on is recognized by 2/3 as at least a minor barrier.
I want you to focus on that last slide a little bit more again, Doug, because the right of self-government is enshrined in the Constitution. Yet in over 40 years, we've seen very little progress. I mean, lots of negotiation going on right now, but in terms of the communities that have actually negotiated full self-government, very few and virtually none in the last little while. I mean, is there anything in these findings or in the experience of the other panelists that give it some insight into why?
If you are asking me first,
Sure.
I don't want to jump in and
Yeah, no, I was.
Okay. Well, funding is a really interesting criteria or barrier that's evolved a lot in our research. And maybe it's evolved more in terms of how we've been asking it and learning different elements of it rather than what was assumed, let's say 8 years ago when we started. Because now there's a sense of, there's a much greater sense, certainly than 8 years ago, of opportunity being available, but funding being difficult to secure. So funding is a barrier, but it's about access to capital more than it's about, sort of a deficit mindset, let's say.
Right.
There's funding required for infrastructure for sure and for all kinds of elements, but in economic reconciliation context and also for self-governance, I think there's more sense now, at least the way we're able to interpret the data of we just need, or not just need, but we need access to capital that other people are able to secure in order to do what other people are able to do.
I know Katie's got some direct examples of where that's actually happening, but before we get there, Don, what are your views on this? I mean, is self-government a major part of the reconciliation equation, or could greater progress be made by focusing the efforts elsewhere?
Self-government is absolutely at the core of reconciliation. I think one big takeaway everyone should have from that work is how important Indigenous people said self-governance is when people might wonder, like, aren't you worried about that clean drinking water we talked about earlier, or, getting a job and being able to feed your family? And yes, of course, people are concerned about that. But I think what you see is a couple things. One is, a response to more than a century of, government dictated control, telling Indigenous people how they have to live their lives and govern themselves. And it hasn't worked. And I think people understand when we can make the decisions that affect our lives and our lands and our families and our rights, we're going to do better than the government. I would say they're going to do much better than any government, federal, provincial, municipal, even though some people have tried some interesting things. But I think that's really key, how important it is with everything else going on and why it is at the core of advancing in all the other areas. I would jump in on one thing that we were talking about, which was the funding. There might be a couple aspects there. One may be the need to build economies, which we just talked about in the last section on economic reconciliation. And I'd be interested in drilling down myself, because funding might also relate to, I'm from Treaty 3, 28 First Nations communities in Treaty 3. Some more easy to access than others, some more difficult. To really move forward on governance, even a specific area of governance, for example, education, you want to do it right. First Nations want to do it right, which means engaging widely with the community, making sure everyone has an opportunity to say what they feel is the way to go forward, building consensus around the way forward. That takes time, and it does take funding to do that. The reserves are underfunded as it is, so to engage in these processes that really need to happen, community to community, is difficult. I will say, though, for example, the Anishinaabe, which is also a group of 28 First Nation communities, confirmed their own education agreement, which was approved in 2017. They moved on education. The Nisga'a years ago got their own citizenship code in place. So some may want to move comprehensively, others may want to look at, well, look, here's our key priority now, but it doesn't mean we're not going to move on the rest, but they may want to move on those kinds of things because they see them as the priority. So again, funding does come into it if you're going to do it right, and it has to be done right if it's going to work.
Yeah, I know those more narrowly focused self-government agreements are the predominant things that are on negotiating tables right now. And I want to talk about that right at the very end. But Katie, first, while I noted that little progress has been made over the last 40 years, where it has occurred has been almost exclusively in the North and in British Columbia. What is it about BC, or what is happening there that makes that province, your province, different than the others?
Oh my gosh, how much time do you have? People are always asking
We
what is
know this
going on in
occupies a big
BC.
part of your day.
So from my perspective, I actually look at this as an asset that, you know, the majority of BC is still unceded territory, and either no treaty or in progress in treaty. And we actually have in BC a modern treaty process that it's 6 steps. It's quite long, but there's different types of agreements that can come into place as you're going through these steps. In terms of it, why I see it as an asset is I think it's always required BC to intersect with our nations differently from a colonial perspective. And that means that you have to come into dialogue differently. I don't think that this has been done well all the time at all, but I think there are examples where coming to the table in a really open way and saying, how do we move this forward? How does self-governance look to you? We have had some pretty fundamental agreements, you know, with the child welfare transfer recently in BC, but there's so much work to do. And just leaning into the funding part, that's where I think BC is also looking at things a little bit differently. There's the funding in terms of programs that we've talked about and capacity building programs, let's say, for, you know, entering into those self-governance processes, just like you were talking, Kelly. Sorry, Don, the long-term process of engagement that needs to happen. So it's done right, it's done well, and funding for that. But the majority of funding has always got these parameters around it. And it's not providing nations with the ability to, you know, invest the way they want to invest in building out their self-governance work. And I think that's the big difference. And I do think there's a lot of opportunity in BC with this First Nations fiscal framework that they're working on, which essentially will take away the province's ability to dictate where dollars go. It's handing money directly to nations to decide how they need to spend it in their communities for what purposes. And that's transformational. That should be how things work.
So the very fact that BC isn't under any of the traditional treaties has actually helped self-government in that province.
Well, from my opinion, I think, you know, trying to take an asset-based approach, it's provided different, it's required different type of engagement and a different type of work together, but there's a long way to go. There's still a long way to go.
Can I give a quick plug here, Allan? Because what Katie said was interesting, and certainly in my time at the Assembly of First Nations, my previous life, you know, BC was always interesting to watch what was happening because it was, you know, they didn't have the treaty making, so new approaches could be tried, but. It goes back to here. I'm going to give a plug for MasterCard Foundation and our LAV program, which is the one where we work with Indigenous partners and organizations that are in deep partnership with Indigenous people and communities. Is one of our core values is co-creation. And the reason that is, it's recognizing, and this should apply to governments and anyone else, the people in the community, the people on the ground know better than anyone what needs to be done. They know the challenges and the barriers because they've been dealing with them for decades in many cases, so they know the solutions better. So when governments come to a group with a program to say, pick from one of these programs, A, B, C, or D, or try to twist yourself to fit this program so you can access funding or resources or an approach that you need, it doesn't work. It should be from the outset, you know, this co-creation process. I think that should apply to everybody because, again, you're going to really achieve impact if you take that approach.
A number of people who have tuned in have put questions into the Q&A box here. Here's the one off the top. Can you provide some examples of where economic reconciliation is going well? Cedar was one example provided, and I think non-Indigenous people need to see what good looks like in order to be inspired to get involved. Don, anything you're seeing out there that would be inspirational to the non-Indigenous population?
Well, I think there, Katie mentioned the project with the Haisla as well. I would look to, we have a number of, and by the way, a lot of what I say is specific to First Nations because I do not want to try to speak for Métis or Inuit. So I'm just trying to be respectful of that. But we've also seen, it may not be inspirational, but it's very creative because, we've always heard about people who say, well, look, these communities in the far north, these First Nations that are isolated, just close them down and they should move because there's nothing that's going to happen. Well, I'll tell you, a lot of those communities are in some of the most resource-rich areas of Canada. And for so long, I remember in my community, we're in the boreal forest. You would watch the logging trucks roll out by the hundreds, literally 100 feet from the prescribed area of the reserve. And sometimes it's not that we'll necessarily want to load up the logging trucks, but there should be some kind of benefit sharing agreements in place that aren't just about necessarily even about just the profits that are generated, but having a say in those approaches. And I'll give you one creative example too. Again, it may not be inspiring, but it's creative. We just saw in Winnipeg the creation of an urban reserve, and this has happened in Saskatchewan as well over the years.
Very interesting.
So some of those supposedly, communities that should just be abandoned, they can actually create reserves and urban centers, and they're not a reserve like you often, may picture in your head. What they are is it's designated as reserve land, which then brings in different tax systems. The First Nations involved will strike deals with the municipality for fire protection, electricity, water, you name it. But then it allows these communities to open businesses on these reserves and services that are for everyone. And they can then generate wealth that then is returned back to the First Nations that are involved. And they can then start advancing on that economic reconciliation that we've been talking about. So I think the key again is let's be creative in our thinking and flexible in our approach because the systems aren't working, but we can change systems. We just need to recognize that we're in a system and start breaking out of that.
I want to get your reaction to what is not a question in the Q&A thing, but a fairly provocative statement. It says economic reconciliation is not based upon joining the wage economy, but is based upon ownership of our resources. Development of a new legal framework that is rooted in Aboriginal ownership. Katie, what's your reaction to that?
Mixed, I would say. I think the reality is that, we continue to define what economic opportunities Indigenous peoples have and have not. That's just the baseline of the structure. So until we're able to restructure that and change those systems and create new pathways that are tangible and accessible, then that's just the reality. So there is a need to actually change the ownership of some of the resources. There is a need to actually change the way that we're planning and the way that our economy works. And with that, that will come changes in terms of what you get paid for, what type of work you're doing, and so forth. So I think they can't just be separated. They need to go hand in hand in many ways. And I look at industries, such as, the kelp industry or the seaweed industry, for example. That's a good example of where there's a lot of opportunity for nations to be part of not only ownership and owning the resource, but also the full supply chain that comes out of that resource. So, everything from manufacturing to distribution to marketing to promotion. That's an area where everything comes in and people would earn wages during that as well. So that I have a mixed response to that, but that would be my initial feedback.
Doug, here's a question that, again, you're going to love. It says, the information provided from the study in this webinar is valuable to increase understanding of Indigenous and non-Indigenous views. How are subscribers to this study using the information to inform their activities or decision-making? What are people doing with this actual information that we're generating?
That's a really interesting question. Interesting to me, anyhow. So I'm glad it was asked.
That's why I'm asking you.
Well, there are a diverse array of interests that different subscribers have. And one of the things that we do is every wave we canvass our subscribers and ask if there's any particular topics that they want to see covered. So we try to accommodate all of them. Sometimes there's a few too many asks, so we can't always do it in one wave, and we have to space it out over time. But Yeah, there's really, as I say, a diverse array. So there are subscribers who are trying to genuinely understand more broadly what Indigenous perspectives are, how they compare to Canadians, and to their own assumptions of what Indigenous perspectives are. There are some who have some very specific, business aligned needs, like resource development, and trying to understand Indigenous perspectives on resource development projects, which has been a fascinating topic to cover. There are a lot who are really interested in understanding how do we have an appropriate DEI strategy? How do we attract and retain and respect Indigenous peoples? And what is it that we can do? Because a lot of them found themselves trying to recruit, right? Which is, I mean, our business, like any other, has made it a priority. But the sheer numbers mean that there's a lot of businesses trying to compete for a few people who probably do fit the criteria for one particular type of job. If it's an accounting job or an engineer's position, or whatever it is. And not everybody wants to do every kind of job. So the competition for attracting talent has helped develop some interest in saying, okay, how do we communicate in a way that demonstrates that we're an employer of choice for them, and that we are a community that's welcoming and respectful. And even if we can't necessarily get to the total number of employees that we want to have who are Indigenous in a short term, how do we demonstrate that we're a respectful employer and a respectful member of a community? So there's all of those things and many more other things that we're learning on behalf of subscribers. And they're using it differently.
We've only got a couple more minutes, so I'm going to ask each of you for final thoughts. Anything that we didn't get to that you really wanted to get out there, Don?
It's been a great discussion and really interesting. I want to thank everyone who tuned in and saw it worthwhile of tuning in. That's encouraging as we head into National Indigenous Peoples Day. I would just, repeat very quickly what I said earlier, that this kind of work supporting Indigenous people and Indigenous young people through education, meaningful livelihoods, that's good for everyone. When we look at some of the top concerns of Canadians, healthcare, Indigenous young people see that as a meaningful livelihood and bringing in Indigenous approaches. Climate change, they want to work on that. Land guardianship, land stewardship, those are all meaningful things that connect to Canadians' priorities about the environment, about better healthcare, a stronger economy. So I think it's really important for all of us to really understand and support this kind of work.
Katie, final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and Don and Doug and Allan, really appreciate it. I would just go back to echoing what Don's saying in terms of it does benefit us all, and really stepping away from the debate and the zero-sum game that we just continually keep kind of walking into when it comes to reconciliation. And we need to move past it. Dialogue is needed. We have to find a path forward, and everyone will benefit in ways that we don't even know yet. There's so much opportunity, it's really exciting if you lean into it in that way.
Doug, you've been analyzing these kinds of findings now for 8 years. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, if it wasn't abundantly clear from data that we showed, please don't assume that there is Indigenous opinion on something. It just as it is with Canada, there are a diverse array of opinions, and there will be sometimes consensus, certainly some alignment on challenges that one might face in their day-to-day life. But in terms of preferences and approaches and support for this or that policy, or a nature of some nature of self-governance, there is debate, and it's robust and it's informed, and it's best to understand the nuance within the population rather than try to assume there's a body of people who think alike and act alike and have similar hopes and dreams and experiences and that kind of thing. And there's some commonality, but there's a lot of diversity.
I want to thank everyone who tuned in. If any of your colleagues would like to get a second read on the conversation that took place, you can find it on our website. There's a link there. We've recorded everything. Those who asked questions, I wasn't able to get to them. We apologize. We'll provide written responses to you if you have an email address attached to them. So with that, thank you all. Take care. Be well.